Dear colleagues, when we are dealing with the general topic of old believers, either that be in the study of the history or more contemporary research, we most often move in a sphere of Russian language and culture, sometimes even exclusively in the geographical boundaries of historical or even modern-day Russia. Today I will speak to you about a slightly different context, namely a sort of old believer diaspora, namely the old believer diaspora in the United States of America in the 20th century. I am myself mostly theologically trained, yet I will in this short presentation refrain from making this too much about theology, but I would rather make an attempt to present a cultural, social, and overall more anthropological approach to the question. During the latter part of the 19th century and early parts of the 20th century, many old believers emigrated to the United States, and many of them ended up in Pennsylvania and in Erie, in Erie particularly. Many of these old believers came from the Suvalki region of modern-day Poland, and they were usually of the priestless confession, the so-called Pomortsi, or shore dwellers, if we want to translate it to English. They had originally come to Suvalki from the northern lakes in Russia to escape state persecutions. In 1916, a large number of Pomortsi old believers were located in the area of Erie, and the leaders of the community decided to build a church, which was dedicated to the Feast of the Domitian of the Mother of God. This church was finished in 1919, and a full-time nastavnik, Father Nikon Pancharev, here on the picture, assumed the role of spiritual leader of the community in 1923. During the following years, the old believer traditions, of course, including the Church Slavonic language in services and Russian in quote-unquote secular life, remained completely intact, and it is safe to say that the members of the community retained their Russian ways fully intact. Clear outward signs of this were, for instance, that the men did not shave their beards, and any contact or relationship with those outside the community were forbidden, or at least very much looked down upon. Religion and culture were being preserved at once, two in one might say. This would, however, change very, very quickly. Soon the occurrence of Americanization became an issue. Members of the parish usually point to the time around the Second World War when this truly became a concern. Men, as you can see here in the picture, who had joined the military shaved their beards. Women who stayed behind in the US cut their hair, while the children began to speak only English. The Second World War started just a few decades after the parish had truly been established. Most of the young men who went out to war had either been already born in the US or came to the US at a very, very young age. All of a sudden, there was an element in their identity that was previously not present, or at least not clearly present, and that is an allegiance to the United States of America. In most cases, it would seem this was rather natural, as the US had given them shelter, a new life, and most of all, freedom to practice their faith in peace. While these old believers surely saw themselves as Russians, the persecutions and their whole history made them much less connected to the modern Russian state of the time. If we shortly stop here and focus on the aspect of identity, this is always a very tricky question. Who someone is, who they feel that they are, how society sees them, etc., is extremely subjective. I think many children of the emigre, children of the diaspora, generally speaking, end up with what we would call plural identities. While for later generations, this might normalize and they accept the quote-unquote new identity of their new homeland, the first and second generations are always subjected to these questions in a very intense manner. Therefore, we can only imagine how these people who are new to this place, yet actually at home, reacted when they had to go to war for their new country. It is clear that this event made them assimilate quicker, and it made them most likely accept that they are actually now Americans. Old believers, yes, but Americans. And so the war came and went. The US, by all accounts, won the war and contributed to the destruction of the Nazi regime in Europe. These men who had gone to war now came back, and in many ways they came back as heroes, as those who had contributed to the war and the victory in the war. This surely must have impressed them, and it is easy to see why they potentially would not want to reject it for the sake of some of their old believer traditions. But rather, even more so, they wanted to most likely embrace it and de facto embrace Americanization. I think that regardless of how much World War II itself contributed to Americanization, surely the years that followed did so very much. In 1952, Father Vladimir Smolakov assumed the role as the new nastavnik, here pictured with his family. From parish historical sources, we find out that while this was the time of the so-called baby boomer generation in the 1950s, a lot was changing in the parish. While the church was packed on Saturday Vespers and religious education classes were attended by an all-time high, the faithful were more drawn to social activities rather than to church services. The activities became the main draw of the parish, it seems to us. As a personal reflection, it reminds me a lot of American and various other Protestant parishes, where the social aspect is de facto the main focus, or at least equally as important as the services and prayer. Perhaps the Americanization influenced the old believers precisely in this way. It is impossible to say for sure, but it could be the case to a certain degree. By the early 1970s, the floodwaters of Americanization were kept by Father Smolakov's finger in the crack. It is clear that by the 1970s, the parish was suffering from Americanization. I say the parish was suffering not because of any hostility towards the USA or Americans that they might have felt, but rather because the old believer ways of the old country did not mix very well with 1960s and 1970s American lifestyle. Father Smolakov retired in 1972, and Father Pimen Simon eventually succeeded him as nastavnik in 1976, here on the picture. By the time Father Pimen took over as nastavnik, the situation in the parish was not good. Gone was the full church on Saturday Vespers, as seen during the 1950s, with most faithful now only speaking English, now not understanding Slavonic or even Russian. Mixed marriages contributed to this, and while the outsiders who would marry the old believers had to, of course, be baptized and accept the Orthodox faith, they, of course, brought an element of a different culture and language. Father Pimen himself married an Irish-American woman who had previously been a Roman Catholic before accepting the Pomortsi faith, so he knew this problem firsthand. These old believers at this point simply did not understand their faith, linguistically speaking. There is an argument made that this was the case at least from the 1950s, although it became very clear when Father Pimen became the nastavnik. And here, as we can see, a photograph from this time around 1970s of a wedding, and this is in fact the old believer wedding. But looking at the people, how they are dressed, how the men are shaved, how the women don't fully cover their hair, we might think it's actually not an old believer wedding, but this is actually a Pomortsi priestless old believer wedding. Anyone who engages in the study of the Nikonian reforms and the history of old believers that later followed will very quickly see the importance of Church Slavonic language. One of the many controversies during the reforms was the Slavonic spelling of the name Jesus. In many ways, it seems that old believerism as a movement and even as an ideology cannot and usually cannot be separated from the Church Slavonic language. Being an old believer usually means to pray in Slavonic. It means to spell words in a certain way. It means to pronounce words in a certain way. It is therefore no surprise that to some, abandoning Church Slavonic in services seemed as though the old believer faith itself was being abandoned. This can, in its extreme forms, manifest as an ideology or even a theology of a sort of holy language. I think, however, that whenever one stands on this question, all can recognize that to stop the usage of Church Slavonic would be problematic to some or perhaps even most old believers. And so it was to a certain degree in Erie. When Father Pimen became nastavnik, he clearly saw the adaptation of English in services as a must, that it was a matter of survival of the community. To him personally, his faith could be explained in English and not only in Slavonic, and because of that, English became the savior of the faith, one might say. To some, this may seem like abandoning a vital part of the old believer culture. However, the argument was that the survival of the faith itself should be the priority and the main focus of the parish. Of course, some, especially older members of the parish, were negative or at least very skeptical. While visiting Erie, I was told of one particular woman who completely rejected the notion of praying in English, instead arguing that the Church Slavonic language was a holy language, given to the old believers, the only remaining faithful Christians by God, to preserve until the second coming of Christ. Without having done enough research on this particular subtopic, I would not be surprised if this view is not uncommon among the more zealous Old Believers even today. And of course, this is not completely strange, as most Old Believers reside in Russia or nearby, meaning that they usually use the Russian language in everyday life, which makes the usage of Slavonic much more natural. In Erie, however, few knew Russian and almost no one knew Slavonic. Finally, however, after much discussions and deliberations, English was introduced to the services, starting on Sunday, of the Prodigal Son in 1980. The services would gradually incorporate more English and less Slavonic. To my understanding, only the language of the services was affected, nothing else. The services remained intact, as they had done before. They stayed true to the Old Believer traditions of the Pomortsi. In many ways, this adaptation of English can be seen as the pinnacle of cultural Americanization of the parish. These Old Believers now, in the early 1980s, mostly saw themselves as Americans. The detachment of Old Believer identity from Russia or Russianness is a very interesting phenomenon that deserves more research, perhaps a research I can myself one day conduct. Likewise, the notion of American Old Believers is in the study of Old Believers, a rather bizarre notion. However, it is the most relevant one for sure. If we follow Old Believer historical views, then the whole Orthodox Church was at some point in history de facto Old Believers. It was Orthodox from their perspective. Following what is seen as the correct rites and so forth. Hence, the notion of Old Believers not being Russians is ever present in the history of the Church before the reforms of Nikon. Today, for instance, the Belokranitskaya priestly Old Believers have priests in Africa and Pakistan. However, there is something in the idea of America as radically opposed Old Believerism, and especially so when Russians who came to the US adopted the American identity. Having briefly explained the process of accepting English, I would now like to equally as briefly speak about the style of English that was adopted. From the outset, it was clear that language of prayer has to be different from the language used in everyday life. Many cultures Slavonic Old Russian, implying it is an older version of the same language. In the case of translating the services into English in Erie, the same ideal was followed. An archaic variant of the language was to be used, one that would clearly be distinguished from the spoken everyday English. And you can see that in the picture. This meant that even those fluent in English had to first put in at least some effort to read and understand the prayers correctly in English. The process of translations was one done step by step. For practical reasons, it was impossible to translate everything at once. And this process has actually been ongoing constantly since the early 1980s up until modern times. Today, the translations of the Erie community are used by Old Believers of various confessions around the world, as well as by what we would say Nikonian Orthodox Christians. Those who do not follow the old rites still use their books, especially their prayer book, old prayer book. It's very popular among many various Christians, even Catholics. Another vital part of the adaptation of English in services has been the translation of the Znammeny chant into English. This has been done by keeping the kruki and by keeping mostly the melodies intact when this was possible. To my knowledge, the Erie community is the only Old Believer community in the world that has fully adopted Znammeny into English, while keeping it very true to the original still sung by Pomortsi in Riga, for instance. I think the adaptation of Znammeny into English has been the most difficult thing for them in this whole process. I am sadly not a musicologist, so I will not provide specific details. However, the Erie Parish has posted Znammeny chant lessons in English on their YouTube page, and to those interested in learning more, I would highly encourage you to look on YouTube and look at their lessons. So the results of the slow adaptation of English mainly has, in the opinion of the parish itself, been a success. It is seen as the first step of saving the parish. While other priestess Old Believer communities in this part of the US have struggled, some no longer existing even, the Erie parish has managed to survive. And that is first and foremost attributed to the usage of English, a language that people can actually understand. While of course a controversial question in Old Believer circles, I think it is safe to say that it worked out well, and the parish celebrated its 100-year anniversary 2 years ago. Apart from the adaptation of English, however, another grand shift took place in the parish in the second half of the 1980s, namely the acceptance of priesthood and leaving the priestless confession. I will now focus on this for a little while. While it can be argued that the adaptation of English was not affecting the faith of the community itself, surely the next big development did so very much. In 1982, 2 years after English was accepted, the parish organized a small study committee. The task of this committee was to examine the history of the Nikonian schism and church history in general, in order to establish if a restoration of priesthood was right and even possible. After carefully studying the materials available, Phillip Calington, together with the members of the committee, reached a conclusion that the parish must do everything in order to unite itself with what they saw as the fullness of the church, which included, of course, the restoration of the priesthood. One of the main conclusions of this committee, it would seem, was that the universal church always had ritual pluralism. The idea of one rite or one way of doing, for instance, the sign of the cross, did not historically exist, they came to believe. Likewise, for instance, the teaching of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, that, quote, the church is where the bishop is, end quote, clearly demonstrated to them that the priestess confession was mistaken for arguing that there were no bishops or priests left. Phillip Calington addressed the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia in September of 1982, and among many things, he expressed the reasoning why the Erie parish wanted to join ROCOR. I will here include 4 of these reasons. There are a bit more in the documents, but these are the ones I believe are the 4 main ones. So the first reason, that the gates of hell had actually not prevailed against the church, and that made the priestless wrong. Despite errors of some archpastors and pastors of the church continued to exist and still does. Number 2, the church remains where orthodoxy remains, meaning where the pure faith is, there the church is. Number 3, orthodoxy, again, pure faith, has been preserved in the Russian church even after the schism. And 4, the lifting of the anathemas towards the old rite by ROCOR, as well as the Moscow Patriarchate, made a unification possible. These mentions by me reasons clearly show that an understanding had been reached where it became clear to many in Erie that staying priestless was theologically wrong. I believe they made the conclusion that they were simply not in the church. The study committee had produced a report where it made it clear that accepting priesthood and uniting with the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was the best solution. Likewise, the visits of Phillip Calington to New York and the offices of ROCOR, as well as correspondence with the Holy Synod, a plan for a reunion was clear and it was shaping up and taking place. However, the bylaws of the parish did not allow Phillip Calington or even a group of people to make the decision themselves. Instead, a full parish vote had to take place, with a needed minimum of 2/3 in favor of joining ROCOR for that to take place and happen. Of course, not everyone supported this idea, and I will mention them a little later, the opponents. However, on January 9th, 1983, a parish vote took place. Approximately 80% of the parish voted in favor of uniting with ROCOR. Phillip Calington was ordained priest in July 1983, and the Church of the Nativity was consecrated. During the Dormition Fest of 1983, Phillip Calington chrismated over 500 parishioners who, on the Dormition Feast in August 1983, partook of Holy Communion for the first time in their lives. The decision to join ROCOR and accept priesthood is, of course, by many old believers seen not only as controversial, but even heretical. The Erie parish did not only accept priesthood, they united themselves with the Nikonians at the same time. Consequences of the decision. Well, as I mentioned, 80% of the parish did accept this decision. What happened to the 20% that did not? They instead chose to remain priestless. The parish gathered a large sum of money for them, which allowed them to build their own church, just a few hundred meters away from the Nativity parish in Erie. Today, this parish, which you can see on the picture, is sadly almost dead, with its last nastavnik dying in, if I'm not mistaken, 2019, and no new one yet being elected. While I was in Erie, I tried to visit them. However, the church was closed. The people who rejected unification with the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia were also mostly the same who were negative towards using English. To my knowledge, the priestess community that did not unite with the Russian Church did not use English in their services either. And so, I have in this very, very brief presentation spoken about the Erie Old Believers and their history of Americanization, adaptation of the English language, and acceptance of priesthood and communion with the Nikonian Church. While I only touched upon the questions of priesthood very briefly, this was a calculated decision. I believe that the topic is more of a theological nature. Instead, I believe the question of Americanization is here of extra interest to all of us at this conference, the adaptation of English being an effect of this Americanization. An interesting question is if this adaptation of American culture and identity also led to any secularization. It has to be clearly stated that today, and for the past few decades, most of the parishioners in Erie have seen themselves as fully American. Old believers, yes. Many of Russian heritage, yes. But American, yes, yes, yes. I want to argue that their Americanization did in fact not lead to any greater secularization. They still hold on to traditional Orthodox morals, and Saturday evenings are still very holy to them, as an echo of old times when they were priestless and the Saturday vigil was the most important moment of the week. The Erie Old Believers present to us a conundrum. We here witness a mix of identities and cultures. We have a group of people that are through and through Americans, yet in their religious life adhere to 400-plus-year-old practices. I believe this makes them quite unique in the Old Believer world, and I hope that further studies can be made of their history to better understand these sociological and anthropological questions. Thank you, dear colleagues. Spasi Christos. Arigato for your attention.